Nashville. Early morning. The kind of quiet that doesn't belong in a radio town. In one studio, a producer lifts the phone. No answer. He tries another station, then another. Same response every time. Measured. Careful. Final. We're not playing Cash anymore. Order from above. No press release, no explanation, just absence. Overnight, one radio voice erased Johnny Cash from the airwaves of the city that decided who mattered in country music and who didn't. The label doesn't call him. His manager doesn't warn him. Cash learns the truth the same way everyone else does. He's alone in his car. The radio is on. Familiar stations. Familiar voices. But the sound he expects never comes. He turns the dial once, then again, and understands exactly what's been done to him. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. By the late 60s, Nashville woke up to radio the way other cities woke up to light. Before coffee finished brewing, before storefronts lifted their metal grates, voices were already moving through kitchens and cars, deciding what mattered that day. A song played often enough became truth. A song that vanished might as well never have existed. Inside the larger stations, playlists were not just lists. They were typed sheets, smudged with fingerprints and cigarette ash, taped to the glass of control rooms. Every title on them meant something. Every title left off meant more. The man behind the morning microphone did not call himself powerful. He didn't have to. Artists waited for his nod without ever seeing his face. Labels courted him carefully, never directly. Advertisers trusted him to keep the mood clean, familiar, unthreatening. His voice sounded friendly, almost casual, but when he leaned closer to the mic, careers leaned with him. The disagreement had not happened on air. It never did. It happened in a small office after sunset, when the building smelled of warm wires and stale smoke. Papers were spread across the desk, lyrics circled in red, notes scribbled in the margins. Suggestions, they were called. A line softened here, a word replaced there. Nothing dramatic. Nothing, on the surface, unreasonable. Cash listened without interrupting. His coat stayed on. He did not sit. When the talk turned to sponsors and tone, he shook his head once. Not angrily. Decisively. The song would stay as it was. The image, too. He had worn black long enough to know what it meant. There was a pause after that. The kind that tells you a door has closed, even if no one says so. The order went out after midnight. No memo. No announcement. Just quiet phone calls and raised eyebrows. By morning, his name was gone from rotation. Not banned, not officially. Simply absent. Anyone who asked was told there had been adjustments. The label pretended not to notice. The manager noticed immediately. He suggested patience. Silence. Making noise now would only confirm what couldn't be proven. Nashville felt different that morning. The same streets, the same traffic. But something was missing from the air. Record stores opened without hearing his voice spill from radios behind the counter. Trucks rolled past with the dial fixed on stations that no longer said his name. Cash heard it from his car. He turned the knob slowly, station to station. Familiar songs. Friendly chatter. Nothing that sounded like him. He didn't curse, didn't hit the dash. He parked, listened a moment longer, then switched the engine off. This wasn't anger. Anger was loud and useful to other people. This was something colder. Attention. By evening, the message was clear enough to anyone who understood the system. A voice that once moved freely had been contained without fingerprints. No enemy to confront. No rule to challenge. Just silence, arranged carefully enough to look natural. Cash said nothing. He watched who avoided his eyes. He listened to what wasn't said. In a town built on sound, he studied the quiet and let it reveal its shape. Silence settled in slowly, not like a shutdown, but like a habit forming. 1 week passed, then another. Stations filled the gaps with safer voices, familiar rhythms that offended no one and questioned nothing. The absence was never acknowledged. It simply became routine. Cash stayed on the road. The theaters were not empty. In some towns they were fuller than before, as if people had sensed something was being withheld and wanted to hear it for themselves. The applause still rose, but it carried a different weight now. Less celebration, more insistence. After shows, people lingered longer, reluctant to leave the sound behind. Backstage, the questions changed. Reporters no longer asked about songs or tours. They leaned in and lowered their voices. Why wasn't he being played? Had there been trouble? Was he stepping back? Cash answered politely and briefly. He never blamed anyone, never defended himself. The lack of a headline made them uneasy. In studios across Tennessee, the Morning Voice continued its work. Between weather updates and advertisements, he let a comment slip. Just a sentence, delivered lightly. Some artists, he said, forgot that success came with responsibility. Some chose stubbornness over sense. No names. None were needed. What unsettled people wasn't the remark. It was the missing response. Industry insiders waited for a counterpunch, a statement, a lawsuit, anything loud enough to validate the story they wanted to tell. Nothing came. Cash declined interviews. He returned calls only to say there was nothing to clarify. The silence stopped looking accidental. It started to look deliberate. Younger musicians noticed first. They heard the crowds. They watched records sell at shows even as radio charts pretended otherwise. A few asked program directors why a voice they respected had vanished. The answers were vague, rehearsed. Schedules, trends, market fit. None of it explained the rooms they had stood in, packed and attentive. One night, after a small show, a singer waited until the hallway emptied. He spoke quickly, like someone confessing a minor crime. He said a warning had gone out. Anyone pushing too hard, asking too many questions, might find their own songs slipping from rotation. Not officially, just gradually. Cash listened. He thanked the man and changed the subject. What others read as restraint was calculation. He understood the mechanics well enough to know that outrage would give shape to the story they wanted. He had seen careers burn bright and disappear because they fought the wrong enemy in the wrong way. Emotion was easy to provoke. Patience was harder to manage. Each night, he returned to quiet hotel rooms. Radios hummed softly while he read or wrote. He never tuned away in frustration. He listened to what replaced him. The choices told him who was nervous and who was confident. Silence, he realized, wasn't empty. It was crowded with information. By the third week, the industry grew restless. The expected collapse hadn't come. The villain refused to play his part. Without noise to respond to, the system began talking to itself, repeating justifications until they sounded thin. That was when Cash made his decision. Not a statement, not a demand, a move. Something that didn't ask permission from the airwaves at all. And for the first time since the silence began, the quiet shifted direction. The announcement did not travel through radio or press releases. It moved by word of mouth, phone calls made late in the afternoon, conversations that ended with a pause and a question. Are you coming? No sponsor logos, no station logos, just dates, rooms, and a promise of live sound. Cash chose places that didn't impress anyone on paper. Old theaters that smelled of dust and varnish. Civic halls with folding chairs and uneven stages. Rooms where the lights hummed and the walls had heard better voices than the equipment ever would. He didn't hide the lack of radio backing. He ignored it completely. What surprised people wasn't that he played. It was who he invited. Local musicians opened the nights, names the stations never bothered to pronounce correctly. Songwriters who worked days and played nights. A few journalists, too, not the polished columnists, but the ones who still carried notebooks instead of expectations. The shows were simple. No speeches, no explanations. Cash walked out, nodded once, and let the band settle. The sound wasn't perfect. It was honest. You could hear fingers slide on strings, breath caught between lines. The room leaned forward without being asked. Midway through one night, he shifted the set. No announcement, just a change in rhythm. The song that followed had been the problem, the one with lines circled in red, the one considered inconvenient. He sang it the way it had always been written. No emphasis, no defiance. When it ended, he didn't wait for applause. "This one's not about me," he said, almost conversationally. It never was. That was all. Someone recorded it. Not professionally. A handheld machine, held steady by instinct more than skill. The tape moved quietly from hand to hand, then further than anyone could trace. It reached places radio couldn't control. Cars, living rooms, back rooms where musicians gathered after gigs. People listened and recognized something missing from their daily dial. Questions followed, not angrily, but persistently. Why was this voice everywhere except where it used to live? Why did it sound more current off stage than on air? Inside the stations, irritation replaced confidence. The morning voice sensed it first. Calls increased. Not complaints, curiosity. Listeners weren't asking for permission. They were asking for explanations. Control, once absolute, now required effort. Cash stayed steady. Night after night, different rooms, same approach. He didn't sharpen the message. He didn't soften it either. The act itself was the response. He let the system hear him without addressing it directly. What unsettled people most was the absence of fear. This wasn't rebellion. It was movement. A reminder that sound existed before it was filtered and could exist after. By the time the shows began to feel inevitable rather than risky, invitations arrived from places harder to ignore. Bigger stages, brighter lights, events that demanded visibility. The silence had failed. Attention was returning, but not on familiar terms. And soon, there would be nowhere left to hide the conflict from the light. The invitation arrived late, dressed in courtesy and urgency. A major televised benefit, assembled quickly, promoted as unity, heritage, generosity. Nashville polished itself for the cameras. Names were stacked carefully. Order negotiated down to the minute. Cash's inclusion came quietly, almost as an afterthought, framed as respect for longevity rather than relevance. He knew what that meant before anyone explained it. Only after he agreed did the details surface. The host list, the producers, and, folded into the structure of the evening like a supporting beam, the same radio voice. No longer just a disc jockey now, but a curator, trusted to guide tone and pacing. A man who understood how moments could be shaped without looking touched. The warning from his team was plain. Don't react. Don't improvise. They want a mistake, something sharp enough to justify what they've already done. Cash listened. He asked about the piano, about the sound check. Nothing else. Backstage smelled of fresh paint and nerves. Performers rehearsed fragments of songs they had played 1,000 times, careful not to risk anything new. Assistants moved with headsets pressed tight, speaking in low, efficient voices. The host walked the corridor shaking hands, smiling a fraction too long. The running order changed minutes before air. Cash's name slid downward, tucked between brighter acts, placed where viewers might drift or commercials might interrupt. No announcement, just a revised sheet, handed over without explanation. When the introductions began, the difference was subtle, but deliberate. Others received stories, achievements, carefully chosen praise. When Cash's turn came, the host shortened the space around his name, skipped the history, smiled thinly, and moved on. It sounded neutral. It wasn't. From the wings, Cash watched the room, the cameras, the audience leaning forward, sensing tension without understanding its source. This was the moment they had engineered, a public edge, a chance for temper to surface. He felt none. When his cue came, he walked out without haste. No wave, no acknowledgement of the slight. The band followed his lead, quiet and ready. He took his place, adjusted nothing, waited until the room settled on its own. The expectation hung heavy. Everyone was listening for something extra, a remark, a glance, a tone that could be isolated and replayed. What they heard instead was restraint, intention stripped down to its core. Cash didn't address the night or the people behind it. He didn't reclaim the introduction he'd been denied. He did something simpler and far more dangerous to control. He began, not as an answer, but as a presence. And as the first notes filled the space, it became clear that whatever they had planned for him, he had stepped outside it entirely. He didn't greet the audience. He didn't wait for the room to give him permission. The band settled into a tempo that felt older than the building, and Cash began as if the night had already been in motion long before anyone noticed. The song wasn't introduced. It didn't need to be. Its meaning lived between the lines, not in slogans or names. Nothing in it pointed directly at radio, or power, or the men who managed both. And yet every word leaned in that direction without ever touching it. The cameras stayed where they were. There was no obvious cue to cut away. No raised voice, no clenched fist, nothing a producer could justify interrupting. The moment moved forward on its own terms, steady and unprovoked. In the audience, people shifted. Some leaned back, recognizing the weight of what they were hearing. Others leaned forward, sensing they were being trusted with something that wasn't meant to be softened. The sound filled the space without asking to dominate it. It didn't need to. When the final note settled, Cash didn't lift his head. He let the silence arrive naturally, the kind that only follows when people are deciding how they feel, rather than how they're supposed to respond. It stretched longer than comfort allowed. Then he spoke, not into the microphone so much as through it. "There are songs that survive without help," he said. "And there are voices that don't belong to anyone but the people who hear them." No accusation, no defense, just a statement placed carefully on the floor between everyone present. The host froze, smile half-formed, eyes flicking toward the control booth. There was no line prepared for this, no segue. Applause didn't come immediately. That hesitation mattered more than volume ever could. When the clapping began, it didn't swell. It spread. From one section to another. From musicians who understood risk. From technicians who had watched switches flipped for reasons never written down. From journalists who suddenly realized they wouldn't need adjectives to explain what had happened. Cash stepped back before it could turn into something theatrical. No bow, no gesture. He nodded once to the band and left the stage the way he had entered it, without borrowing energy from the room. Behind him, the program struggled to resume its shape. The host spoke again, but his voice sounded thinner now, as if something essential had slipped past him unnoticed. The order of the evening continued. But the axis had shifted. Backstage, no one congratulated Cash. They didn't know how. A few people avoided his eyes. Others met them briefly and looked away, unsettled not by confrontation, but by clarity. What he had done couldn't be clipped cleanly. It couldn't be framed as rebellion or gratitude. It existed whole, already understood by those who mattered. And once something like that is heard, it doesn't disappear when the lights go out. It waits. The days that followed carried no headlines, which was how everyone knew something had shifted. Newspapers described the benefit concert politely, almost cautiously, circling the moment without naming it. Phrases appeared that suggested imbalance, an unexpected pause, a change in tone. Nothing actionable, nothing deniable. Inside radio offices, the mood tightened. Calls were returned faster. Doors closed more often. Programmers compared notes they pretended not to be sharing. What unsettled them wasn't backlash. It was uncertainty. The machinery relied on predictability, and the night before had refused to behave. A few smaller stations moved first. No announcements, no statements. One afternoon, a familiar opening line slid back into rotation between weather and traffic. Listeners noticed immediately. Some called to ask if it was a mistake. The answer came back light, almost relieved. Just a request. Word traveled the way it always did, quietly, sideways. By the end of the week, it was clear the silence wasn't holding. Not breaking dramatically, just thinning, station by station, until pretending otherwise required explanation. The morning voice felt it slipping. He began calling people he hadn't needed to call in years. Conversations stayed friendly, but the urgency leaked through. He spoke of misunderstandings, of context, of keeping things balanced. He never admitted to anything concrete. He didn't have to. Everyone knew what he meant. One program director ended the call early. Later, he repeated a sentence to his staff that would circulate far beyond that office. The problem isn't him. The problem is how small we look trying to manage him. The shift wasn't public. It was administrative. Paperwork adjusted. Language softened. Cash's name was spoken again, not praised, not criticized, simply used. Neutrality, in this case, felt like surrender. The label reached out soon after. Carefully, they suggested a path forward that looked generous on the surface. A controlled interview, a reconciliation angle, a way to clear the air without naming who had clouded it. They framed it as opportunity, not pressure. Cash listened. He always did. He understood what was being offered. Visibility, vindication, the chance to claim the moment and define the story while others were still catching up. He also understood what it would cost. Someone else would lose face. Someone else would be reduced to an example. That wasn't the victory he wanted. The tension around him grew sharper because no one could read his intention. Friends assumed he would take what was owed. Critics braced for retaliation. Even those who had quietly helped waited to see which way the weight would fall. Cash spent an evening alone, guitar untouched, radio low. Voices drifted in and out. Ads, songs. One of his, played without emphasis, without commentary, just placed back where it had always belonged. By morning, he agreed to a meeting. Not to reclaim ground, to redraw it. The room was smaller than expected. No audience chairs, no bright panels, no sense of occasion. Just a studio cleared of anything unnecessary. 2 microphones, a table. Coffee left untouched. The door closed softly, sealing the moment from spectacle. The radio man arrived prepared. Notes folded once, then again. He spoke first, carefully, framing the past as confusion, overlap, bad timing. He mentioned pressure from advertisers, from trends, from forces that never carried names. He spoke as if explaining weather. Cash let him finish. He didn't interrupt. He didn't correct the record. When the words ran out, the silence that followed felt heavier than any argument could have been. It wasn't hostile. It was attentive. "I didn't come here for an apology," Cash said at last. His voice stayed level, almost conversational. "And I don't need anything back." The man blinked. This wasn't the script. Cash leaned forward slightly, hands folded, not claiming space, occupying it. "When someone decides which voices are safe," he continued, "they don't just change what people hear. They change what people think is allowed to exist. That kind of power doesn't feel like much when you're holding it, but it lasts longer than you expect. No accusation, no demand, just a description of weight." The radio man nodded once, slowly, not in agreement, in recognition. He had expected anger, or triumph, or terms. What he received instead was a mirror held steady, without judgment. The session ended without ceremony. No handshake staged for cameras, no promise spoken aloud, just an understanding settling into place. A few days later, late in the evening, a song returned to the air. No introduction, no justification. It appeared between advertisements the way it used to, as if nothing had happened at all. That was the point. Cash didn't hear it in an office or a studio. He heard it alone, driving a familiar stretch of road, the dashboard lights low. The voice came through the speaker unchanged, not louder, not sweeter, just present. He reached for the dial and turned it slightly down. Not because it hurt, because he didn't need it turned up anymore. There was no victory lap, no statement issued. The system adjusted and moved on, as systems do. But something had shifted beneath it, quiet and permanent. Power had been shown its limit, and Cash drove on, carrying nothing he hadn't chosen to keep.